Dobrý den, ahoj.
Dobrý den.
Dobrý den všem.
Pěkné odpoledne. We expect a very large audience today, so we started letting people in sooner, but the webinar will start in about 3 minutes, so please give us a minute to get ready. It's actually the highest number of registered participants for any webinars. Any Fulbright webinars. So we are very happy to have that many people here.
Have the participants done any kind of professional learning on media literacy? You mentioned that, and I was wondering if they'd had any workshops or seminars in that area.
Some of them have, and I think the level and the experience will be very different. So would anyone like to share anything specific among the audience participants?
I probably wouldn't get into that too much. What do you think? Eric, is that something that you might want to comment on briefly when you talk about these specific issues and where students can find reliable sources of information?
Can you just say the question again?
Do you think you might want to say something about this, this media literacy issue? I know we're not going to get into that very much, but when you talk about the specific issues and activities that you have students do you want to just mention something about media literacy and how it's, you know, really integral to what you do with helping students find reliable sources?
Absolutely, we'll do.
That'd be great.
Okay, 2 more minutes. We are live on Facebook as well, in case anyone wants to switch the channels, but we are happy to have everyone actively here. And it's great to see our current mentors who are hosting English teaching assistants, our former mentors, familiar faces from other programs, and also I see English teaching assistants, one joining us from the US and one from the Czech Republic. So welcome to everyone.
Wonderful.
Good afternoon to everybody.
Hello.
Okay, it's 4 p.m. now, 10 a.m. for some of our participants in the US. Welcome everyone. My name is Kristýna Žmuráňová. I am the program officer of Fulbright Czech Republic, currently in Prague. And it's my great pleasure to welcome our 3 wonderful speakers who are joining us today from the US. And I'm sure you all have read their carefully prepared profile, so I won't bore you with repeating that information. And we will dive directly into the theme. And the first speaker today will be Elizabeth Washington, who is teaching at the University of Florida. Then she will pass the floor to her colleague, Judith, who is teaching at the University of San Francisco. And the third speaker will be Soto-Shed, who is teaching at the Harvard University. And so I am passing the floor to Elizabeth, and thank you everyone for being here with us today.
Thank you, Kristýna. Good afternoon, I guess I should say, to our participants today. I'm so glad that you could join us for this session on teaching controversial issues. And if we could just introduce ourselves briefly. As Kristýna said, I'm Elizabeth Washington. I just returned, in fact, from 4 months in the Czech Republic as a Fulbright Distinguished Scholar and had a wonderful experience at Masaryk University. At the University of Florida, I teach social studies education courses. I coordinate the teacher education program for secondary school and also the social studies education program. And I've been here for 27 years, I think. Judy, would you like to say a little something by way of introduction?
Sure. Thanks, Elizabeth. Greetings, everyone from Berkeley, California. It's wonderful to be with you all. I am a professor of teacher education at the University of San Francisco, and I teach foundation courses in learning and teaching, teaching for diversity and social justice, and the master's courses in curriculum. And most recently, I've piloted a new course on teaching controversies. Thank you. Eric?
And hello, it's great to be here again. My name is Eric Soto-Shed, and I work at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, where I train social studies teachers. Been there for about 8 years and doing teacher education and teaching high school for about 25 years. I'm really excited to join y'all today.
I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. We have some slides today that we are happy to share with everyone. If you would like a copy of this, we will work that out with Christina. Let me get this going. So our general idea is teaching controversial issues in a divided nation. In the US, it seems that we're very polarized and have been for some time now, and don't really know how to talk to each other across those poles. And so Judy and Eric and I have spent a lot of time talking about, and I've learned a lot from them in talking about teaching controversial issues with our teacher education students, giving them strategies and resources that will help them feel more comfortable. And that's what we hope to do with you today, and to talk about some specific ways that might be comfortable and productive for you to do in your own classrooms. So we'll talk about the main concepts and issues that we wanted to raise today, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end for as long as you'd like to ask them. Any questions at this point? So our main components of the webinar, first of all, we want to talk about what we can learn from research about teaching controversial issues, whether it's to younger learners in school, to teacher education students, to practicing teachers who want some guidance and some room for kind of a creative exploration of how to teach controversial issues. It's not easy to do, and we hope that we're going to show you some ways today that will make you feel like it's easier and more accessible. We also want to talk about what we can learn from skilled teachers, what we can learn from teacher educators who work with pre-service teachers, and that applies to Judy and Eric and myself. And we have learned, I think, a great deal from our students, and certainly Judy will talk about her research that she conducted as part of the Spencer program so you were in 3 countries, Judy. So we'll hear about that. And then also practical tools and resources for inquiry-based instructional strategies with examples from our own research and also from practice in a variety of school contexts. So just by way of introduction, teaching controversial issues is pressing and also very difficult in the world today, certainly not just in the US. A lot of teachers fear that these issues are going to spark classroom conflict, that there'll be some kind of a backlash in their school or from members of the public, parents, et cetera. And they also worry about whether these discussions and exposure to these issues would cause any harm to their students. And those are all very real and understandable concerns. So this webinar is for novice teachers, experienced teachers, teacher educators, any school leaders who want to develop their practice in this area of teaching controversial issues. So our key components for the webinar that I just told you, learning from skilled teachers, learning from research, learning from practice with our own students in the teacher education program at our respective schools. And then as far as our agenda for the webinar, first of all, we want to talk about kind of the context for this discussion and the conceptual framework for the way that we think about controversial issues, how to define them, as well as how to teach about them. We're also going to talk about research and the idea of reflective practice for teachers who are learning how to do controversial issues discussions in their classrooms and want to really study their own practice. We're also going to give lesson examples and some tips for planning these lessons. And then by way of conclusion, just some key takeaways from the presentation and some resources that we suggest that may guide you in finding a lot of good sources of information for activities that you might want to do in the classroom. So I said a divided nation, and that's certainly true. If you look at the list of examples here of some of the things that are divisive in the US, the backlash to the Black Lives Matter movement that's been going on for over 2 years, almost 3 years now. We have a lot of controversy and divisiveness now around the issue of reproductive rights. As you probably know, because this was such a global issue, what are the rules around COVID? And then also, I think a very pressing issue in the US lately has been voting rights legislation and how different states in the US want to modify those laws in order to make it either harder or easier to vote, depending on your point of view. So these issues are certainly relevant to Florida, where I live. It seems like we're dealing with all of these at once right now in Florida, but I think a lot of people can relate to some version of these in their own country, in their own context. And certainly there are issues specific to particular countries. And I think about the time that I just spent in the Czech Republic, and it seemed like the concerns were around the presidential election when it was narrowed down to 3 candidates, and there was a lot of discussion about who might win in such a close race. And also the issue of Ukraine, both in terms of the Czech Republic's role in the military action there among NATO allies, and also the issue of Ukrainian refugees. And the Czech Republic has taken in many, many refugees and is sorting out housing and school and all kinds of things that go along with making a stable existence for these refugees. So what do we mean by controversial? One definition is problems and disputes that divide society and for which significant groups within society offer conflicting explanations and solutions based on alternative values. That's a definition from some time ago that I think is still relevant today. So one example of that that Eric and Judy and I talked about that is also a very pressing issue in the US, should police departments be defunded? That's certainly a controversial issue. Almost anything related to law enforcement is controversial in the US. Also, questions of public policy that spark significant disagreement. Sorry, I'm not advancing here. Okay. So drawing from the COVID example again, the question here might be, should schools reopen and under what conditions? And so that would be a matter of public policy, both at the national level and at the state level. And in the Czech Republic, you've probably had some similar discussions about wearing masks, when to quarantine, when not to quarantine, all kinds of tricky issues around that we're still dealing with, even though the virus is more under control these days. Also, sensitive questions related to contested histories. That is, histories that people don't necessarily agree on whatever the outcome was. There's, in most cases, there's a historical event that has different perspectives on the role that different countries played and different people played in those histories, and how you kind of reconcile when groups of people have two very different understandings and interpretations of history in their own countries and in world history. So one example of that we thought of, who was responsible for the Rwandan genocide. That was a horrific event, and there was blame to go around on many sides in that. And so that's a good question to talk about a contested history. How did it start? Who did what? How was the situation resolved? And what are the ramifications for Rwanda even today because of this genocide? And then historical events, political questions, and cultural expressions that evoke emotional responses tied to community allegiance and identity. So these would be the kinds of history, politics, culture that people feel they have very strong feelings about it. And there may not be, they may not necessarily have a lot of facts on their side, but as we're going to talk about, one of the things that we want to teach students is how to find reliable sources of information so that they won't just be reacting by emotion, but that they can make a rational argument for their point of view. But certainly we acknowledge that emotion can be a big part of this when we're talking about contested history and when we're talking about people's sense of personal identity. An example of that, should offensive symbols be displayed in public? We've dealt with that a lot in the US, for example, with the issue of war monuments, especially those of the Confederate United States during the Civil War. So these are often very contentious discussions. One of the things that I wanted to point out in particular about this, I've talked about controversial issues here, and I've also talked about contested history here. And I think it's important to make the distinction between controversial issues and difficult issues. Judy and Eric, if you want to jump in here, please feel free. But the way that I think about that is controversy is something that legitimately has two or more sides, and it's a pressing public issue that people need to deliberate on and find some solutions to. Controversial issues, people may not agree on any solutions to those, but we want them to be able to at least discuss those issues in a way that feels safe and productive. So controversial issues, that's one thing, but then when we're talking about difficult issues, those aren't necessarily contentious in terms of having several different perspectives on the situation. But difficult history usually involves some kind of trauma. We mentioned the idea, the event of the Rwandan genocide, that would be considered difficult and traumatic history. And so it's important to separate the two. Sometimes they can overlap, and you might have something that's both controversial and something that involves difficult history. But I think it's important to make sure that when we understand that we're talking about difficult history, we usually mean something that happened that was very painful for a lot of people involved, and society is still reckoning with that. So why teach controversial issues? What are the rationales? Fortunately, there are quite a few. The first thing that we really want students to do, that's sort of the starting point in all of these discussions about teaching controversies. We want to help students be able to cultivate ideals and practices that benefit democracy. What are the practices? What are the skills? What's the knowledge? What are the dispositions that students need in order to be effective members of a multicultural democratic society? We also want controversial issues teaching and learning to include the teaching of civil discourse and deliberation and dialogue, so that students can talk to each other in a respectful way and in a substantive way, because they've done the research on the issues that they're concerned about. We also want to teach controversial issues to promote inquiry and analysis. So a rigorous form of instruction that has students doing some of the research for themselves and drawing some of their own conclusions about what they make of the issues that they've studied. Also, we want to teach controversial issues in order to encourage those diverse perspectives. And we want to hear multiple opinions in a classroom when we're talking about some of the issues that we know are important to a lot of people. We want to increase civic engagement among students. Our hope is that when we teach about these issues and get students engaged and excited about them, that they can develop some political knowledge that will support them when they want to engage civically in their community, in their country, however they want to do that. They know some strategies based on learning about controversial issues that will help them articulate what they want to do in terms of civic action in their community. And then another thing that's sort of related to that is the idea of political capital. And we want, through controversial issues discussions, if we give that opportunity to participate in those discussions to all students, we're increasing their political capital in terms of their ability to effect change when they take their place as adult citizens in their country who feel like what they say matters and that they can contribute to the discourse on a particular issue. I put this quote at the bottom of the screen from Walter Parker, who is a nationally, internationally renowned expert in civic and citizenship education. And he raised this question that I think is so profound that I keep coming back to again and again in my teaching and in my research. And the question he raises, that there's no quick answer to this. It's something that hopefully people continue to discuss over time. But the question is, the most important question for democracy is, how can we live together justly in ways that are mutually satisfying and which leave our differences, both individual and group differences, intact and our multiple identities recognized? What is needed to teach controversial issues effectively? From our own research and practice, From our own research and practice, we've come up with some ideas that we think apply to almost any teaching situation that we want to emphasize with our own students and as we work with other teachers who are effective leaders of classroom discussions. First of all, it starts really with the teacher's self-awareness and their ability to do very thoughtful decision-making, to think through things carefully about what they want to do and why they want to do it when they bring up controversial issues discussions in class. Also, it's important to have an open classroom climate, a climate that supports inquiry, that supports civil dialogue, that supports students' ability to find the information that they need to support their points of view. But an inquiry, a classroom with an inquiry or sort of spirit is an exciting place to be and is certainly consistent with what's needed to understand controversial issues better. Also, teachers benefit from knowing about a lot of different kinds of resources that are available for inquiry-based lessons. And we want to talk about some of these resources when we get to the end of the presentation today and pass along some ideas of where you can get really good materials about specific issues and how to frame those for students and get them to do their own investigation of those particular issues. Teachers, to teach controversial issues effectively, we emphasize that teachers need to be able to skillfully facilitate class discussions. This can be one of the most difficult things for students to learn when they don't have any previous experience participating in classroom discussions. That was certainly the case when I was teaching in the Czech Republic this past fall. I had students who they eventually spoke in class, but they were reluctant to speak at first because they really had no experience participating in discussion throughout their secondary education experiences. And so in order to teach controversial issues effectively, we've got to help students with their comfort level participating in classroom discussions and their ability to effectively state their point of view and listen to others as they express their points of view. And then finally, we want teachers and students just to have a variety of learning activities, a variety of pedagogical strategies that will be useful in different situations, depending on the issue that's being discussed, depending on the classroom climate, and depending on what the students are interested in discussing as well. Judy, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about your research project for the last couple of years.
Okay, thank you so much, Elizabeth, for setting such a strong foundation for us. So actually, time flies. It was several years ago now. In 2016 and 2017, I was on sabbatical for my teaching position, and I got funding from the Spencer Foundation to conduct a research project on how teacher educators actually prepare their pre-service teachers to do this really important and demanding work. And the reason that I wanted to conduct this study is because there's really abundant research on teaching controversial issues that have been produced by scholars in different countries. And it's really fascinating and wonderful research. But there was nothing on how to actually prepare teachers to do this work. So I wanted to address that gap in the research, and also for my own practice, learn from expert teacher educators who were really involved in preparing their own students to teach controversial issues. And I also wanted to go to political hotspots, countries where there was social and political division, because those are the most interesting places to study teaching controversial issues. So I went to Northern Ireland and studied 2 teacher educators there. And I went to the Midlands of England. This was after the Brexit vote. So I studied 1 teacher educator in England. And then I came back to the US and studied a teacher educator at a university here in the Midwest. I have published several articles and a book called Hard Questions, Learning to Teach Controversial Issues that I'll talk about in a minute. Next slide, please. So the way that I went about my research was I showed up at these places. I stayed in each location for several weeks, and I went to the teacher educators methods classes in citizenship, social studies, and history education at 4 different universities. And I observed classes being taught. So I observed the teacher educators with their pre-service teachers. And I conducted a series of interviews with the teacher educators and a handful of their pre-service teachers a few times over the course of the year. The final interviews were conducted on Zoom, which, believe it or not, was new at the time, had not used Zoom before, but that was a very effective way to follow up with my research participants. I also collected documents from the classes that I studied and from the teacher education programs, and I really tried to immerse myself in each of these communities. When I visited, this was twice during that school year. So I learned as much as I possibly could about the history of these places, about the social and political dynamics, and about the cultural environments that these teachers were studying in. And I just want to say a little bit about Northern Ireland, because that was the most fascinating site for my research, because Northern Ireland has such a long history of very intense division. And we tend to think of it in terms of Catholics versus Protestants, but what I learned was that it's actually much more political than it is religious. It's just the way that those religious groups tend to line up politically. So Protestants are aligned with Great Britain, which conquered the island of Ireland, and that conquest was kind of finalized in 1690 by King William III, also called the Prince of Orange. And that event is still celebrated in Northern Ireland by loyalists, who are most often Protestants. And on the other hand, Catholics are aligned with the Republic of Ireland, and do not want to be united with Great Britain, the United Kingdom. And one of their heroes is Bobby Sands, who in 1981 died as the leader of the hunger strikers who were in prison, and they were protesting for the rights of political prisoners. Very politically and emotionally charged events and historical figures. Next slide, please. So in these places, all of them divided, Northern Ireland most dramatically, I was really interested in how teacher educators addressed the fears that their pre-service teachers had about teaching controversial issues when socio-political and cultural and religious divisions are so profound. Also, Northern Ireland is still grappling with the legacy of the Troubles, which was a 30-year period of violent conflict that happened between the late 1960s and the late 1990s. And peace is fragile. And here in the United States, as Elizabeth talked about, we have become increasingly polarized. So these are very, very difficult socio-political climates for teachers to be working in. And the pre-service teachers that I studied brought their anxieties to their teacher ed courses. And those anxieties include losing control of the classroom, a conflict among students, and getting criticisms from administrators and parents and community members. And what I found was that the teacher educators that I studied had very thoughtful ways of addressing those anxieties. They actually embraced them, they acknowledged them, and they taught their pre-service teachers strategies for managing them. And these strategies as a whole kind of revolved around 8 different elements. So I created this framework for reflective teaching of controversial issues to help teachers be able to use these strategies in their own classrooms. And these strategies revolve around cultivating a supportive environment, which Elizabeth talked about, selecting authentic issues, preparing thoroughly, choosing resources and pedagogies, thinking through their own stance as teachers, guiding discussion, communicating proactively with stakeholders, and addressing emotions that come up in the classroom. Each one of these can be unpacked in a variety of ways. I have a website. You can find it if you Google Judy Pace on teaching controversies, and the framework is on the website, and I've curated some tools and resources that can help teachers address each of these elements. And the way that I think about and talk about this whole set of strategies is contained risk-taking. So the teacher educators encourage their pre-service teachers to take the risk of opening up controversial questions to their students, examining multiple perspectives, using rich resources. But at the same time, they taught them how to contain these risks through these various strategies. Next slide, please. So we'll delve into a couple of these elements. One is selecting authentic issues. So what teachers need to think about very carefully is what are the issues that they're going to bring into the classroom to open up to inquiry on multiple perspectives and classroom discussion. So issues should be related to the subject matter the teachers are teaching so that they can justify their choice of these issues. They should embody multiple and reasonable viewpoints that teachers want their students to explore. That means that fake news is not going to be part of the equation, right? So you want to bring in credible resources that present reasonable views. Teachers want to open up questions that promote inquiry and discussion, and they want to build up to issues that are more charged, politically and emotionally charged over time. So these are examples of open, controversial issues that would be very beneficial for discussion. What is a fair refugee policy? When should free speech be limited? Should genocide denial be a crime? But these are issues that probably would come later in the year after teachers have developed a trusting and supportive classroom climate. So in the beginning of the year, there could be issues like, should the voting age be lowered to 16? Should animal testing be banned? Questions that are more comfortable and safer for students to explore. They could also be controversial issues that are located in places that are distant from your own home country, right? So issues that are going on in the United States might be safer for your students to investigate before they take on issues in the Czech Republic. Next slide, please. So here are some examples of developing good controversial questions that are related to topics that you might want to explore with your students. So if the topic is free speech, then the controversial issue or question might be what kinds of speech should be censored. And that would get into the larger issues of free speech and protecting individuals and groups. Responses to terrorism might be another big topic. And a question might be, what are the consequences of government responses to terrorism, which would be dealing with the larger issues of security and privacy? Reparations in the United States. So the question might be, what kind of reparations should be paid to the descendants of enslaved people? The peace walls in Northern Ireland, I showed you an image a few slides ago. When should the peace walls in Belfast come down? So those peace walls were constructed during the Troubles to protect different communities, and they still exist. So there's a real question about, when is it time to actually deconstruct those peace walls so that people can live in a more integrated society? So it's really important to frame a good inquiry question that you're going to pose to your students to get them really engaged in thinking about the controversial issue. Next slide, please. And then another element in the framework is how to thoughtfully choose resources and pedagogies that will really engage students in investigating the issue and exploring different voices and perspectives and sources, and also really get them to want to participate. So there are lots of popular methods. There's something called structured academic controversy, which has been very popular in several different countries. There was a big research project called Deliberating in a Democracy, where teachers got professional development on structured academic controversy, and then researchers followed up with them to find out how they were doing with it. And the teachers really enjoyed it. They found it pretty easy to use with their students, and students got really engaged in those conversations. And it really forces the teacher to hand the conversation over to the students. They're working in small groups. They're taking up different perspectives, and then they're deliberating on coming up with a solution to the question. There's also something called walking debate. Socratic seminar may be something that's familiar to people. I just did one last night on whether progressive education is good for all students, using Lisa Delpit's article from 1986, still very controversial. There's town hall and role play and simulation and ranking and sorting activities, source analysis and jigsaw, many, many different methods. So you can find some of these examples on my website. And I also wrote about how the teacher educators that I studied use these different methods in my book, Hard Questions. And then there are many types of resources. So news articles, primary sources, counter narratives, film, digital media arts, murals, case studies, music, podcasts. Teachers can be really, really creative in the kinds of resources that you bring into the classroom, but you do want to be really thoughtful about how they might affect students, and also remember to bring in sources that are valid and legitimate that students can examine through the lens of media literacy, which I think Eric will be talking about a little bit later. Next slide, please. And then finally, I want to acknowledge that the pre-service teachers that I studied were able to pick up some of the tools that their teacher educators taught to them in their methods courses, but they had to adapt them to the student teaching context that they were working in, their school placements. And I found through their stories about their student teaching that they were considering a lot of different factors that affected them. They were considering their students, the curriculum that they were assigned to teach, their own teacher identity and what they were ready for. Some of them were really excited about having discussions in their classes. Others were more hesitant. They weren't quite ready to take that plunge. They were also thinking about their school community, the demographics of the school. There were many institutional constraints that they had to deal with, whether or not they got support from their mentor teachers, very constrained schedules. Unfortunately, in Northern Ireland, citizenship courses, which is where controversial issues would be taught, are sometimes only 35 minutes long, and they only happen once a week. So they had to deal with all of that. And then, of course, they were also thinking about, the issues that were happening in the wider society, current events, national politics, et cetera. So I identify factors that supported the pre-service teachers in taking up controversial issues teaching, and also factors that constrained them. And the bottom line is that supporting teachers in doing this work is really key. Support from their colleagues, from their administrators, from parents and community members is really, really important. Thank you so much. I'm going to pass it over to Eric.
Thanks, Judy. And before I jump into a framework that I'd love to give around how to think about selecting issues and pedagogy and strategies, I want to kind of take up this media literacy theme, because I think it's just really central to the work of engaging students in controversy, because there's so much controversy that's being generated in our discourse and our discussions in the media. And what I want to say is that I really think that there's two key things that teachers can be doing to equip students to engage in controversy, particularly controversial issues that they're being exposed to the media. The first would be around explicit instruction into how to critically read or interpret the media. And, there's been some really interesting work out of Stanford, particularly the Stanford History Education Group, where for years they looked at how do historians critically read documents and sources. And what they found is that reading and interpreting and analyzing online sources in the media, it's a different skill set, right? And so they kind of compared how do expert fact checkers analyze the media compared to historians and students. They found that there were some really discrete skills and specific skills that fact checkers use. And so if you check out on the Stanford History Education Group's webpage, it's a tool called the Civic Online Reasoning page that has a number of resources that talk specifically about how do you critically look at a tweet, or how do you look at videos that you see that come across your social media feed? How do you begin to sort of look at web resources with a real critical eye? And they give you sort of background videos, practice lessons, but it's this explicit practice and naming of skills that I think is really essential and could be powerful to help your students analyze issues in the media. The second thing that I think teachers should do, and this I think speaks to some of what Judy was saying and some of what I'll be talking about, is to give them consistent exposure to different views in the media, right? And that will provide practice opportunities for them in your class in a space that you've curated for students to say, like, wow, I'm hearing really different stances on a controversial issue from different media outlets. How can we begin to make sense of that? And through giving students those practice opportunities, it really allows them then, when they're sort of outside of your classroom and exposed to stories, to bring in some of those skills. And so a resource that I use with teachers and they use with their students, that's great for here in the States, and there's some international resources there. It's a website called All Sides, or All Sides Media. And what they do is they take whatever the popular news stories are in, and they present it from three different perspectives. A conservative perspective, a sort of middle ground perspective, and a liberal perspective. And just pull in the news stories, the current events from those different perspectives and place them side by side. They also have some lesson plans and other sort of resources around how to do that. But I find that that's just a real good go-to when I want students to sort of look at different perspectives in the media to provide them with those practice, but also real just thinking opportunities to think through different stances. So I just wanted to name those two sort of approaches. One, to explicitly instruct students on how to read the media, as well as to provide consistent exposures to different sources in the media, as I think two really powerful and foundational approaches to helping students engage with controversy that's coming into the media. What I'd like to do just for a few moments now is to offer up an approach about bringing the controversy into your classroom and really kind of building off of the work that Judy shared and Elizabeth shared. And so the specific question that I want to address is something I think I've experienced, and I think many of you might have, and that is, how can we design lessons about controversial issues while mitigating, reducing the potential harms to our students, right? So we all thought, have you ever had an experience where you're like, this is an important controversy, I want to bring it into my classroom, but is there a possibility that some of my students might hear a perspective or a view that they find harmful? So how do we deal with that? Can we go to the next slide, please? So I think there's really sort of two questions we want to ask when we're trying to think about what controversial issues can we bring into our classroom. The first is, how charged is the issue? Is this a question that's being intensely or hotly debated? Are there strong positions within my community that I teach in? And so a charged issue is one that's likely to bring emotional responses out. And so the question you want to ask before sort of deciding to teach it is, how charged is that in terms of the community that I work in? The second, and if you're speaking, is thinking about the students in your classroom. And are there any students, particularly those from marginalized backgrounds, that are likely to be harmed? Right? Is it possible that students might be negatively implicated in the controversial topic? Or are there perspectives on the topic that may harm students? Asking these two questions is essential to really thinking through, how can I really explore the controversy in the class without necessarily harming any of my students? If you go to the next slide. This captures kind of like a nice high-level summary. So there's two things you're thinking about. If we can go back one slide there. How charged is the issue, and are my students implicated? By thinking through those two sort of sets of questions, it's going to allow you to go through a number of strategies. Judy just went over several, and think about what's the best goal and what's the best instructional approach given these sort of responses to these two questions. So let me show you what this looks like. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thanks. So this framework that I came up with to work with new teachers in particular says, the extent to which an issue is charged and implicates your students can inform the goals and instructions of your practice. So if you look at this sort of spectrum that I've created, on the left side is the bright red. Think of that as hot, heated, intense, right? And these are issues that are really charged. Lots of debate are going around these, and I think they might harm some of the students in my class. So 6 or 7 years ago, when I was working with students who had a lot of undocumented immigrants in their classroom, there was an intense debate in the United States around immigration policy that was brought on by the Donald Trump presidency. That was an issue that was being contested, debated in the presidential campaign, but it had a direct implication on some of the undocumented students in the teachers' classes that I work with. And so that's an example of a bright red burning issue that's really intense. So we want to think about, how are we going to teach that? On the other side is the green, right? And that's something that's an issue that is controversial, right? It is being debated, but it's not as intense, and I don't think it's going to implicate my students. And based on where you fall in that spectrum can inform the types of goals and pedagogy that you bring to a lesson. So going back to the left side, when it's sort of bright red and it's sort of charged and harmful, these are opportunities for discussions where the goal is to reflect, to understand the issue, perhaps even to analyze the issue. But what we don't want to necessarily do is a debate or a role play, because when you begin, if the issue is really charged, because if I have a student in my class that's an undocumented immigrant, and we're going to do a role play or a debate about, should we have undocumented immigrants in America, that debate really attacks and questions the fundamental humanity and belonging of the student in the classroom. And so similarly, though, if you do have an issue that students aren't directly sort of tied to, teachers can feel much more confident in having them argue, having them debate, and having them do role play. Now, the one big caveat that I want to give here is that this is just one way to guide your planning. It's not sort of a hard rule that you must follow. In fact, there should be times when we're arguing about issues, right, that our students aren't part of, right? But that just requires a lot of relationship building, a lot of skill. If you go back to the framework that Judy presented around contained risk-taking, there's a lot that needs to be in place. And oftentimes as new teachers or at the start of the year, or there's some uncertainty we have as teachers, we're not sure how to do it. This is what I'm saying is a very safe way to say, let me take on the controversy and do it in a way that doesn't harm students. So I don't want to say this is the only way, it's just one way. So I kind of want to wrap up by like naming a couple of examples, and then I think we're going to bring a conclusion and hear from you some questions. Can we go to the next slide, please? So here's an example, and these colors, again, kind of represent the spectrum you just saw. So bright red is all the way on the left. These are charged topics, what I think might implicate my students, and we want to have some reflective discussions. And on the right, you have the green sort of debates that are like not as charged, not as harmful. I don't think there's going to be any harm for my students, and we can be much more confident about doing debates and role plays. So I'll just name those two, the examples on each extreme to give you a sense. So we have a lesson from the 2020 election in America, which was quite literally a controversy in terms of who won, okay? And also what was at stake for who won between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. And the teacher that I worked with was teaching a lesson the next day in Washington, D.C., miles away from the White House, right? So there was no escaping this controversy. This was on the news. This was in the minds of students. This was literally in the city within which this teacher taught. And so they had to address it. But the teacher was also tasked with creating a lesson for that teachers would use in all of the advisories classrooms for that day. And so rather than having kids say, like, you know, let's just do an open free for all, or let's just have a kind of debate around who do we think won and why, we knew that there was a lot at stake in this, and a lot of students had very, very strong feelings. So on one hand, they didn't want to avoid the discussion, but on the other hand, they wanted to make sure that there were no sort of harmful situations or harmful remarks made. And so what they had was a highly structured group discussion where students were invited to share their thinking, but it wasn't about debating who's right or wrong, okay? On the other side of the spectrum, we designed a very intense debate where students were arguing right or wrong over the Electoral College debate. And that's just the way of which we choose our president in the United States, that we don't have a direct democracy where the total number of votes, whoever gets the most votes wins. And so this is a very, nuanced, complicated system. But it does have big implications on democracy. It has ties to the legacy of slavery. It does sort of impact whose vote really matters. So there's a lot at stake here, but students in your classroom are likely not going to feel as connected to this. So this is something where we do want them to argue about and debate about because it is important, and we can feel that they can get really engaged in the debate without necessarily being exposed to any harm. So these lessons, if we make the slide deck available to you all, which I think we can, are all linked here, and you can kind of take a closer look at them in the materials. So with that, I think I want to turn it back over to you, Elizabeth, to give a couple of concluding remarks before we open it up to discussion. This is just the summary of the framework that we can see right here. And Elizabeth, I think we can take it to the conclusion.
Elizabeth, you are muted.
Oh, I was muted. My apologies. Really, the most essential thing that we're trying to get to here with talking about these strategies and resources, Eric and Judy and I are coming from the stance that teaching controversial issues is urgently needed for democracy. If we're going to be a thriving democratic society, it's something that we've got to learn how to do. Yet we also acknowledge that it can feel very risky. And it certainly does for my teacher education students who haven't been in their own classroom yet. And they're very concerned about the risks involved in, for example, classroom management. What might happen if they have a discussion that kind of goes off track. But it's urgently needed, and there need to be ways to figure out how to do this in ways that Eric was just talking about that mitigate potential harm to students depending on how heated the issue is. Teaching controversial issues also involves inquiry and discussion on significant open questions. That is, questions that don't have a right or wrong answer, questions that involve rational points of view, different points of view among different groups of people. But the questions are open-ended so that students have a space to do research on their perspectives and then be able to articulate that in a discussion, to be able to explain why they think the way that they do. We also believe that research in divided societies offers guidance for reflective practice that contains the risks of teaching controversial issues. Certainly, Eric and Judy and I are very interested in and focused on the divided society that we find ourselves now in the United States. And we're trying to look at examples of teachers and our teacher education students doing their own sort of investigation about, you know, what are my practices? What do I think is the best thing for me to use in this particular situation? I acknowledge the risks. Here's how I might deal with those risks. So we're talking about strategies for cultivating a supportive classroom environment, selecting and framing authentic issues, and choosing resources and methods. The risk of harming students, we believe, can be mitigated by aligning your goals and your instruction with the types of issues that you want to cover. A reflective practice framework includes these things that are listed here. If you are a reflective teacher, you are thinking about how to make your classroom a welcoming place, a place where students can feel trust, and also selecting authentic issues, real issues that involve real consequences and real points of view that people can't necessarily agree on. And then just to kind of reiterate something Eric said about the risk of harming students. Again, we emphasize here aligning methods with the types of issues that you want to talk about, whether they're more or less emotionally charged, and what do you need to do in each situation. And then finally, there are many, many resources for teaching controversial issues. They are abundant. We certainly emphasize that we want teachers to have a lot of support in being able to conduct these kinds of discussions, but the resources are there, and we have a lot to share with you in one of our slides that's coming up that we'll pass along to you that I think have some really good resources for specific issues and kind of how to frame them and how to get students to talk about them. Here are our many references, just to let you know where some of the research comes from. We'd like to share that with you. And then finally, here are our links for recommended resources. And of course, we want to start with Judy's Teaching Controversies website, which is an excellent resource. She also mentioned structured academic controversies, Socratic seminars. We mentioned the Stanford History Education Group. So there are links to all of those. And then some other things, as you can see on the rest of the list, that help you facilitate the discussions and find appropriate and robust resources for students to investigate. This last thing on the list here is something I really like, and I've used in my own work with teachers who are teaching very difficult and what I would call traumatic history of African Americans in the United States. And one of the things that's really come in handy with the highly charged topic like that is this resource here at the bottom, Let's Talk, Facilitating Critical Conversations with Students. This comes from an organization called Learning for Justice, which has excellent materials and lesson plans and films, all kinds of things that would fit into one of these discussions really well. But it also talks about the how of having these discussions. How can teachers get ready for these? What to do if things start getting tense or if things seem to be going wrong during the discussion, maybe how to get students to sometimes step back and take a deep breath before they say anything more in a discussion that they might regret. But lots of good ideas there on not just the what, but on the how. And those are our slides. So I will go back to our main screen here, and it looks like we have some things in the chat. Christina, did you want to?
Thank you very much to all of you. We do have about, I think, maybe 5 more minutes. Maybe we can go a little bit over time if there are many questions. So now is the space for audience question, please. I see one hand raised. So Mr. Alexis, if you want to unmute yourself and ask, please feel free to do that.
Big thanks to all the speakers. Thank you very much for the presentation. It's been lovely to listen to your experiences. I wonder, especially if a teacher wants to teach controversial issues over a period of time, I think that will definitely be more impactful, obviously not doing it just once every month or so. Would you find it, would you think it'd be helpful for students to reflect on what kind of skills they're developing? And would you think it would be perhaps a good idea to have a framework or something of the sort to share with the students and say, these are the skills that we're looking at? Perhaps some of the things Elizabeth was talking about in her presentation, where we're developing civil discourse, and we're developing, you know, we're all trying to build a safe space. Would you think that that would be perhaps a way of, I'm not sure if motivating, but well, basically my question, sorry for taking it so long, is how do you offer feedback on the things that are important in such a difficult, you know, for such difficult topics?
So you're talking about skills and dispositions that students can cultivate, not just the content knowledge that they would gain from participating in these activities. I think that's such a great point. Judy and Eric, if you want to speak to this, please do, but I'll just say quickly, I think that's a very essential part of doing these kinds of discussions. And I like the idea of teachers, and they can get their students involved in this too, develop some kind of rubric that they can use that lists some of the skills and dispositions that they agree are important for having these kinds of discussions. And then the teacher can evaluate based on that rubric that students understand. But also, I think it's a good idea to have students evaluate themselves. How do they feel their attitudes or dispositions are changing, or maybe they're not? But kind of how do they feel about themselves taking part in these kinds of activities? Judy, Eric, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, I'll just jump in that last night, I told you that we had a Socratic seminar. And at the end of it, I asked students to write a note assessing themselves on their discussion participation, on their analysis and reasoning, like using evidence in the text to support their ideas. I had a number of bullets under each category. And then the last one was civility. And then I also asked them, you know, what are your big takeaways and what are your burning questions? So I do that kind of reflection a lot. And I think that also I wanted to mention that in the beginning of the semester, the beginning of the school year, I have my classes develop norms, right? So how are we going to have productive discussions where people feel safe and are able to take risks and feel respected, and we have an open classroom climate? And I've had the students also assess themselves and the class on those norms. So those are just a couple of ideas.
And I can just add very, very briefly, great idea to sort of track systematically those skills. I think the framework for the teacher could maybe be a little bit more complex than thought out, and what you present to your students can be a little bit more streamlined and high level. I think that just makes it easier for student engagement. And then along with the great idea of tracking skills and Judy's open-ended prompts, I would encourage you also to maybe have students think about feelings and emotions, because the exposure to controversy over time is not only necessarily growth and improvement, but it's just also like, what is the experience like and how am I feeling and how does that change? How does it stay the same? But I think that could be a very powerful complement as well.
And I see a question from Sharka in the chat. Did you provide students with arguments for and against in the research and let them use them, or they had to prepare themselves? Great question. In my experience, it depends on the students. It depends on the audience. If I were, let's say, a middle school teacher, and I was teaching, let's say, the Jim Crow era during U.S. history. That's a very highly charged topic, but I think considering where it is in our historical timeline, students could probably discuss this in a meaningful way. And if I were teaching younger students, I would probably go ahead and provide them with some different points of view, because they may not necessarily have the skills yet to go and do a lot of deep dive for material that would be relevant and also material that's reputable. So if my students don't have a lot of experience in doing that kind of research, in doing these kinds of discussions, I think I would facilitate that by providing some things at the beginning that represent completely different points of view on a particular issue. Judy, Eric, you want to add anything to that?
I think you really covered it there.
Okay.
Let me go to the other question that's there.
Yes,
there are
please.
two questions that ask a similar thing. What is your recommendation to avoid clashes with parents or your school director? There are two people who are very concerned about raising issues with parents. Is there any recommendation for you how to work, how to communicate with the parents who maybe later come to school and complain about an issue being discussed the way they don't like?
I think the first step is to make sure your school administrator is on your side. So you've developed some trust. You've developed a reputation as a fair-minded person who's going to let students have a say in what goes on in class and not just kind of try to dominate the conversation. So having that kind of support from the principal is absolutely crucial. In my own experience, I would give as an example this unit plan that I was working on with some schools here in Gainesville about teaching the history of racial violence in U.S. history. Again, not controversial issues, but very difficult issues to study. And so in that case, we drafted a letter that we sent home to parents. We drafted a letter that we gave to students saying what we were doing, why we were doing it, and what we hoped to get out of it, and how we would appreciate their support. That took care of a lot of issues, but that may not necessarily be the case again, especially here in Florida. So what we also try to emphasize to our students is, we have curriculum standards in each state, and they're mandatory. They're supposed to be taught. And we tell students that anytime you can tie what you're teaching to one of those standards, just in some way, it may be a tangential way, but if they can relate it to the standards, then they can give a rationale to parents who might be upset, why are you teaching this? This doesn't seem like it ought to be in a history class, but you can show them the standard and say that it's your responsibility to teach those in a fair-minded way, and that's what you're going to do. Judy, Eric, I don't mean to monopolize the talking here.
Well, I was just going to say that, educating parents about teaching controversial issues and why it's so important and what it's all about, I think is important. And also making parents understand that this is not about teachers indoctrinating students with a certain point of view. This is about cultivating independent and critical thinking. So I think proactive communication with parents and other stakeholders is really important. And I think it makes a difference.
One more super important question that's very relevant in our Czech context. What would you do to make reluctant Czech secondary students want to speak about controversial issues? If you ask a question, if you try to have a debate and no one seems to have any opinion, no one wants to start, what do you do?
Yeah, that was a challenge. I found that my sort of whole class discussion approach didn't really work. I would ask a question and it would land maybe kind of awkwardly and nobody really said anything. But I found that when I tried other kinds of instructional strategies to get students talking in a way that felt more safe to them, I would do, for example, a think, pair, share activity. Turn to the person next to you or get into a small group of 3 people and talk about this question that I'm giving you. And then the person who feels the most comfortable can share out from the group about what their group decided on the issue, what conclusions they drew, what their points of view are. But I think that's a way to help people maybe feel a little bit safer. But then also any kind of activities where you have small groups, a structured academic controversy, those are usually done in groups of 4. And there are some really solid guidelines for how to do one of those discussions. And I think that might help too, because it gets students in small groups first so they can talk with each other and not necessarily worry about speaking to the entire class.
And I would just add real quickly, another popular strategy is a written conversation. So it can basically be done in writing with a few people and you're kind of exchanging different ideas in writing. It became quite prolific with Zoom school that we all went through the past year and a half, but you can do it live in person as well. So that's one other piece. And then I think, Elizabeth really hit home in terms of like the, small groups. Another thing you can do is, practice controversy, right? So you might begin with, I think, one of the most important debates, chocolate ice cream or vanilla ice cream, what's the best one and why? And just begin to get some of that discourse and warm folks up before you get them into the much more substantive issues.
One final thing I would add is maybe getting input from students about the issues that they really care about and want to discuss with each other.
Thank you very much. There is one very good question, or there are many very good questions, but one that I still want to flag. Is there a framework for compassionately but firmly intervening to correct a student's problematic belief or statement?
I don't know if it's a whole framework, but my colleagues at Harvard have developed a series of talk moves of things you can say, like, do I approach this with direct correction, or do I approach this from a perspective of curiosities? And so my colleagues Mira Levinson and Aaliyah El-Amin have developed a really great framework that I use in my teaching. I will check with them because I don't know if they formally published it to see if I can share it, and I will certainly pass it on if I can. And it's a really useful way to approach dealing with problematic or just inaccurate charged comments.
I think that may be one of my resources, Eric. I think under cultivating a supportive environment or addressing emotions, I think it's under one of those categories on the framework page. But I'm not sure. So you and I should check on that. But at least some of it is in. I'm not sure whether it's the whole framework that you're talking about or whether there are bullet points that have been included in another document. So yeah, I think those are really, really helpful. And then there's like this whole question about how do you deal with students that bring conspiracy theory into the classroom? And I was actually working with a couple of colleagues, 2 in England and 1 in Canada, about this. And my colleagues have done more work on it than I have, certainly. But I think the general idea is that you don't want to confront a student in public, in the context of the whole classroom, that you want to sort of say, that's an interesting point. Let's talk about it after class, because in a public arena, it draws too much attention and might actually reinforce the problematic idea. And students may feel like they have to save face and they may become resistant. So I think the psychology is really important to consider. The psychology of the student and what's going on around that, bringing the conspiracy to class and looking for attention is really important to consider. But hopefully there will be more work on this coming out soon because it's definitely needed.
Yes.
And Judy, you are right. The framework is on your website. This is a plug to go to Judy's Teaching Controversial Issues website. There are so many, all the resources I can think of and that we've mentioned, I think are there. So I'm going to go ahead and just highlight the specific resource in the chat, but I would encourage you to check out the Teaching Controversies website as well.
Eric, do you have that pulled up so that you can share the screen or?
Yeah, I put the,
okay, I see.
Yeah, I put it in the chat. And so folks just click on that link, you can kind of pull it up, and it's it has essentially the framework that I was talking about.
Excellent.
No.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Elizabeth, would you like to add anything to the last question?
I was going to mention the idea of some kind of a framework to deal with students who have some problematic ideas that might involve treating certain other people as less than human. I've certainly been in classrooms where teachers had to deal with that kind of an issue. And I totally agree with Judy about confronting the student in class. I don't think that's ever going to end well, but it is important to talk to the student if they say something that's particularly egregious. But I would also add that with the experienced teachers that I've worked with, and what I tell my own students is, as Judy and Eric say, it's so important to establish that classroom environment of trust and security and respect and civility. And when you've worked on that for a while and you feel like that the students get that and you see that demonstrated in their behavior, you may actually see fewer incidents like this of somebody just blurting out something that's really offensive, because they know that's not what we do in this classroom.
Thank you very much. That's a beautiful way to end the webinar. Thank you very much to all the participants who've been with us for more than an hour. And most importantly, huge thank you to all of our US speakers and presenters. It was wonderful. Thank you very much for your time. I will share the resources together with the link to the feedback form with all the participants tomorrow morning. So all of you who registered will receive another email from me tomorrow. And thank you very much for your participation. Great seeing many of you, many of the familiar faces, and we look forward to seeing you at another Fulbright event sooner or later. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Oh, and Christina, I'll send you this PowerPoint because there are probably a couple of changes on it since you last looked at it. So I'll send you the